Thanks, Stephanie. All right, so I'm excited to share some information with you all about universal social emotional screening. And in particular, this is intended to be an introduction to embedding this type of approach within your multi-tiered system of support. So I'm just going to try to screen ahead a few slides. Okay, great. So my hope today is that, as I said, this is an introductory presentation. So my hope for today is that you leave the chat with an increased understanding of both the value and the function of using a universal screening approach within your MTSS, and also have a better sense of what is involved in terms of not just selection of a universal social emotional screener, but also what would be involved if you were to implement a social emotional screener as part of your Tier 1 system. So before we get started, we wanted to do another poll to get a sense of what types of data your teams are currently using to identify students in need of additional support. Thank you, Troy. We'll get Natalie to speak up a little bit. Okay, so Stephanie's just pulling up the poll here, and you have several choices. So the first one being extant data. So this would be using things like office discipline referrals. Then we have early warning systems, teacher referral, meaning some sort of process that if a teacher has a concern, they can get assistance from your team, versus having a formal teacher nomination procedure, which typically involves having some sort of definition and criteria, and then teachers selecting a certain number of students who may meet that criteria, and then finally a standardized universal screening measure. I'm just going to wait a moment for all of you to complete the poll, and then we can share those results. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a lot of responses in the area of using extant data as well as teacher referrals to be making these types of decisions. Okay, great. So that fits well with within kind of the purpose of this presentation, and that's to introduce using a standardized universal screening measure and procedure. Okay, so to close the poll, all right, so I'm going to start the presentation really with focusing in on a description of the problem. And this is to give us a sense of why even bother with universal social emotional screening procedures. So we know that about 1 in 5 students has a diagnosable disorder or mental health problem. So that means that they're meeting criteria and that this problem is interfering with their day-to-day functioning and does not include students who may be at risk or kind of more in that subclinical range. And what's most concerning is that the majority of these students aren't accessing the supports that they would benefit from, and the ones that do access additional intervention or supports are typically accessing them when a problem has gotten so severe that intervention is less likely to be effective. We have lots of representation from school districts, so all of us that have worked in schools know that schools have traditionally and continue to kind of function as de facto mental health service providers trying to meet these unmet needs of their students, but really within the context of having limited resources to do so, and often having to respond to a lot of crisis types of situations, which really speaks to the importance of developing that multi-tiered system of supports and really approaching these concerns more from a prevention-based approach. We also know that students who are experiencing social and emotional problems are at risk for a myriad of negative outcomes, from more immediate things such as missing school or low academic performance, safety issues, suicidal ideation. But then without any intervention, there's also increased risk for long-term negative outcomes, right, that persist over a lifetime. So if these things aren't addressed, we see things like students dropping out of school, long-term or underemployment, increased healthcare costs, and so forth. And really, our role as educators is to create a context a positive context where students can engage in learning so that they can stay in school and achieve good grades, attain kind of the social and emotional skills that they need to be successful. And really the purpose of our multi-tiered system of supports is to teach these social emotional skills and create environments that are going to foster that student well-being and the academic outcomes that we want to see for our students. Okay, so I really like this quote here because I think it emphasizes several important features when we're talking about universal social emotional screening. One, as I've hopefully been emphasizing, that this is one component of a coordinated and comprehensive school mental health program. And it's intended to really align with the mission and vision of your schools and districts. Universal screening is intended to identify those students in need of additional supports and facilitate the process of linking students to effective interventions and services, and ultimately to help us support students in achieving those outcomes that are valued by the students themselves and family and school community. Some assumptions or important features that relate to universal screening is that we're talking here about practices that pertain to all students. So these are measures that are completed for all students regardless of whether there's a presence or absence of a known risk. So these measures are completed to the entire student population. They're also intended to identify future risk of social, emotional, behavioral, or academic problems. And they also provide important information to how well are Tier 1 or universal interventions supporting our student population as a whole. So within the context of your multi-tiered system of support, we're using different types of data to make varying types of decisions, right? And so when we're talking about universal screening, this type of data can be really valuable in terms of evaluation, screening, progress monitoring, those universal supports, maybe even in terms of Tier 2. Universal screening is not intended to be diagnostic. And that's an important difference to keep in mind when you're selecting instruments and setting up these screening systems. Okay, so some of the benefits of universal social emotional screening include that this is a proactive approach, right? As we're moving towards really integrating those academic, social, emotional, and behavioral supports within the context of schools, a social emotional screener can provide really important information in terms of identifying those students in need of additional intervention, as well as, again, monitoring your Tier 1 system. There's also the assumption and the benefit that early intervention tends to be less expensive and require fewer resources than if we wait for problems to get worse, and therefore end up being in a situation where you need more intensive assessment and intervention. Universal screeners can also help identify those students that are under-identified. And this is particularly relevant to students who are experiencing more internalizing types of problems. So these are things that are less observable. So a student who's really worried, experiencing some sort of anxiety or form of depression. And these students may not be particularly disruptive, and some of them are still doing quite well academically. So we know that generally educators are, we tend to do a better job at noticing those students who are disruptive. So a universal screener can also help us identify these students early. And then finally, since these are standardized research-based instruments, they also can help mediate bias and help collect information from multiple informants across multiple locations, and thereby provide important data as we're making those decisions around our universal supports and who may need additional intervention. Okay, so to summarize, universal screening should be integrated into your MTSS, and take into account all the considerations that we think about when implementing any practices, such as the resources that are going to be needed and also the systems that need to be in place to support the practice. So things like your data collection system, your database, getting buy-in, all those sorts of things in terms of planning. You also want to be sure that when you're deciding on what type of universal social emotional screener to use, that this is really well aligned with the objectives of your MTSS and also indicators that are going to be valued by educators, families, as well as students. And then, of course, aligned with policies and procedures, and really foundational is this idea that with better data, we can provide early intervention and thereby either prevent or ameliorate problems from becoming worse over time. So universal screening, often there are numerous concerns that come up in discussions when we're working with schools or districts that are working towards implementing this type of approach. And these range from how do we communicate this information to families, consent, what are we going to do if we have a lot of students with a lot of need, concerns around false positives, the cost that might be associated with implementing these practices. And these are all important considerations and really speak to this being a process that takes time to implement. But these are all barriers that can be overcome with good planning. Okay, so there's two big questions that I'm going to be reiterating that I've already kind of mentioned a couple times so far. Really, the big questions or the big ideas behind universal screening are to answer the questions of, one, which students are in need of additional supports, as well as which students are not, and how well are Tier 1 or universal interventions supporting all of our students. And when selecting universal screening measures, we want to make sure that they're appropriate, so really matched to the needs of our students and the context of our schools. They need to be usable, so thinking about things such as the cost, how feasible is it to implement these measures, to collect the data, all of those different types of things. And then, of course, the technical adequacy. Is the instrument reliable and valid? And then finally, does the universal screener have utility? Right? So we're always asking the question of, is the data that we're looking at contributing to us doing a better job in supporting our students to have the positive outcomes that we're hoping for? So most of the standardized universal screeners that are available can help you collect information from a variety of informants. And there's pros and cons to who you collect this information from, and that's part of setting up your system and figuring out which informants make sense for you to be getting your universal screening information from. It is important to note that in general, students tend to rate themselves differently than their parents and teachers do. We tend to see pretty low cross-informant agreement. There are also several different types of screening approaches. So I'm going to assume that many of you have probably been in on a meeting where school psychologists may be reporting results, and they might be referring to some broadband measures. These are typically rating scales that have a lot of items and then have various subscales, and then if the student scored high on a couple of those subscales, school psychologists may have used an additional narrow band measure like a depression inventory. When we're talking about screening, best practice is considered to use a multiple gate approach. So what that means is that we're using multiple methods to be making decisions around which students need additional intervention. And the idea is that at that first gate, you're going to have a lot of false, or not a lot, but you're going to have some extra false positives, because you want to make sure that you're capturing all the students who may be at risk. And then in the following gates, you use additional data sources to identify who really needs supports, and then of course to match them to the appropriate type of intervention. So some additional sources of data, and from the poll that we had at the beginning, sounds like most of your teams are collecting these types of information. You may consider things like office discipline referral data, looking at attendance, your academic data, and then also take into consideration things like who's spending a lot of time at the nurse's office. Perhaps they're reporting some of those somatic complaints that we sometimes see with students who tend to be under-identified. And in some of our trainings, some of you may have seen this before, it's an example of an assessment schedule to help a team really think about when are you collecting different types of data throughout the course of a school year. All right, so some characteristics of universal social emotional screeners include that they're easy and quick. Right? This is something that you're administering to the entire school population, so it needs to be feasible and not too time-consuming. It needs to be affordable. I have yet to hear of a school that has an abundance of funds. Technically adequate. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Also valid for the population within your school, and again, making that link to positive student outcomes and embedding it within your support system. Okay, so when you have a team that's working together towards implementing a universal screening procedure, it's really important that one of the team members is familiar with test development and has an understanding of what to look for in terms of an instrument's psychometrics, so different indicators of validity and reliability, to help the team as they're going through figuring out which instruments are a good choice for their school population. School psychologists maybe are a common person who might have this type of information that could be brought onto the team if they're not currently a member. And again, treatment utility. I have this in here several times because it's so important that we're linking this assessment information with the decisions we're making about supports and really have some evidence that it's helping improve outcomes for students. So I don't want to get into a lot of kind of psychometric test development jargon, but one of the things that standardized social emotional screeners do is research and really look at where is that fine balance between identifying all the students who have a problem and identifying all the students in the population who don't have a problem. And both of these, it's a fine line because if an instrument tends to err on the side of identifying students with problems, you are going to have more false positives and be putting resources into assessment and potentially intervention for students who may not necessarily need it. Whereas on the other hand, if your test is too conservative, then you're going to be missing students who may be at risk and ultimately missing opportunities for early intervention. So here is a short list of standardized universal social emotional screening tools. The instruments on this list are ones that you can fairly easily access information about them. Most of them have been around for a while, and the ones that have little asterisks next to them are available commercially and also have data systems that are linked to them, and therefore also have associated costs. Again, this list is not exhaustive. This is also an area as more and more schools across the country are implementing universal screening practices. There's a lot of new research and instruments are coming out, and again, it really needs to tie back into what it is that you're trying to screen for. But this list is a good starting point to give you a sense of the types of tools you might want to consider and look at. And just to show you a couple of examples of no-cost instruments that you could take a look at. One is the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire. This tool has been around for quite some time. It's short, and it's also, I think I just mentioned, available for free. Here you can see another example. This is the Student Risk Screening Scale, and this is how it might be set up if you're collecting teacher report information, where the teacher lists the students in her or his class on the left side, and then provides the ratings. And with all data that we collect, we're also always bringing it back to using a data-based problem-solving approach. And universal screening data allows you to do that in a way that we do with other types of data that you're already currently collecting. So on this graph, you can see a screener that was implemented once in the fall and then again in the spring, with 61.3% of the students being not at risk, and then presumably here some sort of additional universal supports were maybe put into place, as well as additional supports for those students who were at risk, and then in the spring we see an improvement. Just like with other data, you can drill down further and look at this data across teachers, classrooms, and so forth. Okay, so in thinking about implementing a universal social emotional screening system, it's important to remember that implementation is a process, right? So there's a lot of different components to this process. And really, as I mentioned, today's chat was really intended to introduce social emotional screening. And if this is something that your districts are interested in, we encourage you to let your PBS contacts know, and we can certainly provide some support to your district in teams in developing a universal social emotional screening system and addressing the things on this list as well as other important considerations as you're moving forward with implementation. So some of the things on the list here include things such as getting that buy-in, of course starting at the district level, but then making sure that you're also getting buy-in from your staff and family, the whole piece in terms of resource allocation, defining roles and responsibilities, some of those ethical and legal considerations, working through those up front, and then selection of the right screener, perhaps doing a pilot, getting some input from different faculty in your schools on their preferences for different instruments, where they see the need for universal screening, and then all the professional development that is involved in implementing this type of system. So things like administration, what are the procedures around that, to decision making and linking students in need to intervention. So we have a couple more polls to get a sense of where your districts are at with universal social emotional screening. With the first question being, has your district considered implementing a universal social emotional screening system? Okay, great. So from those of you that responded, I'm excited to see that we have slightly more yeses than nos. Then the next question we have for you is, for those of you who answered no, we're wondering if after today's introduction, if you intend to share this information with your district. Okay, great. So we have a lot of yeses here. And then finally, what additional information or resources do you feel you would need from us for us to support you in these efforts? I see examples of universal screeners, what to use, when to use, and how to use it. Great. Information given to districts to identify the need for such a system. Right, all the considerations that go into making decisions around obtaining parental consent and student assent. Examples, great. What to do with the data. Okay, great. And we really appreciate your input. Our project is moving forward with technical assistance in this area. We would be excited to work with you. Again, please let your PBS project contact know if this is something that you're interested in. And we'll be sure to follow up with you because we're developing resources to address all of the different areas that you just listed in response to that last question. Okay, so this is our last and final poll, which speaks to if you think your district is at a point where you'd be interested in accessing additional support from the PBS project specifically. You can type in your district name now. Otherwise, if you want to just follow up with your contact later, that would be fine too. Great. Great. And we'll make a note of the list here and be sure to follow up. All right, so thank you. I'm really excited to see the amount of participants on the chat today. Really appreciate your interest and participation, and really excited to see the number of districts that are interested in learning more and working with us as we move forward with these efforts. And we have some time for questions. And I guess before we move into questions, I just want to note that the next online chat is going to be November 4th at 3 o'clock. So any questions you have at this time, you can type into the box. On the slide here, you can see two books that have come out fairly recently that might be good resources to get you started that really are a book dedicated to addressing the many different areas of consideration as you move forward with this type of approach.